the refrain, and we all know who they are, but we saw you experiment with a black woman in what I thought was an extraordinary sequence. So I really appreciated that. I'm interested in what you're doing with science. I'm interested in how you're going to explode it, blow it up, turn it around, and I'm looking forward to that, for that experiment to continue, because it's something that's so important, especially from the critique of the Black radical tradition, what science has done to the world and what we might do otherwise with science. Yeah, open and curious. I think this is a phrase that I thought that was a good kind of leitmotif of the presentation, and I felt open and curious at the end of it. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Simone, for this. And I want to, rather than reproduce what both Adam and what everyone has said so far, I wanted to focus on the aspect of science that you are trying to explode and to unpack that history. And I'm particularly interested in that history. Look at that, I'm being so radical that even the dogs are barking. But I'm particularly interested in that because it touches on my own research. So I'm going to bore all of you now with that. Because for the last couple of years, I've been interested in how algorithms actually shape and continue a project of coloniality from the 16th century onwards. And one of the things that people forget is that algorithms exist as a continuum of operations that were laid down by Persian astrologers to read the skies and look for omens and look what the future might entail. And these predictive operations were mathematical in nature. Moreover, the word algorithm comes from Al-Khwarizm, a Persian astrologer from the 6th century after Christ, whose work in mathematics was so groundbreaking that algorithms carry his name.
Sorry.
Thank you. And we're back. The name of this scientist, this Persian astrologer, is now embedded in our technology. And algorithms at the time were mathematical operations used to predict what might happen. Royalty had their own astrologers who were also mathematicians. And now we associate horoscopes to anti-science, but there was a time when the horoscope and the scientific operation were one and the same. And this is the part where some people are shocked to hear that we think of time in a linear way, and we think of time in a way that is a legacy of enlightenment. And this time itself is also a colonial construction, because when the colonizer arrived in the Americas or in Asia later on, and they encountered communities that measured time differently, one of the ways that hegemony was imposed was by erasing the concept of local time or the way of measuring time, and imposing the Gregorian calendar, imposing the way that the hours and the minutes are measured. These are things that were not universal. Of course, I can get cliche and direct all of you to look at something like the Mayan calendar, but that's one example of one way of measuring time. What happened as a result of colonization is that we ended up with a universalized conception of the Newtonian chronology. And if you allow me to be self-referential for a quick second, as if I wasn't already self-referential enough, but anyway. I want to read just a quick thing. Newton is considered one of the founding fathers of enlightenment and of modern science. He also wrote more than 3 million words on the occult, the supernatural, astrology, and tarot. For example, Newton extensively studied and wrote about the Temple of Solomon, dedicating an entire chapter of the chronology of ancient kingdoms to his observations of the temple. Newton's primary source of information was the description of the structure given within the King of the Hebrew Bible, which he translated himself from Hebrew. As a Bible scholar, Newton was initially interested in the sacred geometry of Solomon's temple, such as golden sections, conic sections, spirals, orthography, projection, and other harmonious construction. In that sense, how different were his pursuits from those of the 11th century scholars of Persia and across the Arab world, combining astrology and geomancy to cast predictions about the future. Upon his death, Newton's death, his heirs were terrified that these writings would come to light and tarnish his reputation as a proper scientist. So they hid those pages, which only came back to light in the late 19th and early 20th century. It was John Maynard Keynes, an economist who worked on financial prediction analysis in the 1930s, who brought Newton's papers on esoterica and the occult and created an archive of them. Grace Bobson, the woman who created the largest archive of Isaac Newton's objects in the US, was married to a man who was dead set on proving the evils of gravity. To prove these evils, he gave a prize every year, which Stephen Hawking won 3 times. The day before writing this lecture, this was part of a larger lecture, I was commenting on my research, and I jokingly said that I feel that this paragraph contains a novel already. It is taken from an interview with author Sarah Dry, whose research and scholarship compiled the occult writings of Newton in her book, The Newton Papers. And she says, there is Grace Bobson, who created the largest collection of Newton esoterica in America. She was married to a man who got rich predicting the rush of 1929, and her husband based his market research on Newtonian principles, using the idea that for every action there is an equal and opposite reaction. The market goes up and it must go down. Interestingly, he thought of gravity as an evil scourge. He had some relatives that drowned, and he thought that it was because of gravity that pulled them down into the water. So he started the Gravity Research Foundation, which went on to do research on anti-gravity technology. And the reason I'm particularly interested in this side of Newton is precisely because of how rational people will go on about astrology and tarot being invalid forms of knowledge and unscientific, while the man who set the basis for our modern understanding of science and linear time used both astrology and tarot extensively as part of his daily scientific practice and production. Sorry if I got a bit too excited over this. But I have a larger point, I promise. My point is that your explorations of science and rationality, this hegemony didn't have to be so. And even the history of Western science contains the non-hegemony. And part of the problems with these hidden histories is that we tend to believe that the non-hegemonic ways of thinking can only come from the outside. But they are already here, and I mean, they have even been produced by the same people that later on were used to impose these models. So there is much more to this science that you are trying to unpack, and I hope you go further with this than these rational and supposedly rational. There is nothing rational about any of these, but these supposedly rational and objective ways of looking at the world, which are projects of identity and projects of accumulation of knowledge, of resources, etc., that didn't have to be so because other things existed, other possibilities were there, and these were choices that now have to be unmade. And I want to thank you for bringing all of this to the forefront, and I hope you continue and you move forward with it.
Thank you.